The human psyche is a labyrinth of untold complexity, a realm where our deepest desires and most profound fears engage in an eternal dance beneath the surface of our awareness. This dance, as Carl Jung would observe, shapes the very essence of our existence, directing our choices, influencing our perceptions, and ultimately determining the quality of our lives. Today, we delve into a subject that touches the core of human suffering: the 3 emotional mistakes that silently sabotage the lives of 90% of people walking among us. Perhaps you felt their presence in your own life, those inexplicable moments when you became your own worst enemy, when your emotional reactions seemed to hijack your best intentions, when you found yourself repeating patterns that led nowhere but to familiar disappointment. What if these self-sabotaging tendencies weren't random failures of willpower or character, but rather the predictable manifestations of universal psychological mechanisms? What if, as Jung proposed, these patterns represent not our personal shortcomings, but our unconscious participation in the collective shadows that haunt humanity as a whole? Consider this possibility: the emotional traps that have ensnared you throughout your life, the reactions you later regret, the opportunities you've unconsciously rejected, the connections you've mysteriously severed, might actually be expressions of archetypal forces operating through you rather than from you. This understanding doesn't absolve responsibility, but rather relocates it from the realm of self-blame to the domain of conscious awareness and integration. The modern world, with its relentless emphasis on rationality, productivity, and external achievement, has created the perfect breeding ground for psychological fragmentation. We've become strangers to our own emotional landscapes, unable to recognize, let alone navigate, the complex currents of our inner lives. Jung would observe that this disconnection from our emotional reality constitutes not merely a personal failure, but a collective tragedy, one that manifests in the epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, and existential emptiness that characterize our era. When we examine the lives of those who repeatedly fall short of their potential, who sabotage their relationships, or who remain trapped in cycles of self-defeat, we find a common thread: not a lack of intelligence or opportunity, but a profound misunderstanding of their own emotional nature. The journey we're about to undertake together explores territories that might feel simultaneously foreign and eerily familiar. We'll venture into the shadowlands of the psyche, those regions we've learned to avoid, dismiss, or deny. Through Jung's penetrating insights into the nature of the unconscious, we'll illuminate the 3 fundamental emotional mistakes that keep the vast majority of people living lives of quiet desperation, forever disconnected from their authentic potential. These mistakes aren't simple behavioral errors that can be corrected through willpower alone. They are complex psychological patterns woven into the very fabric of our being, expressions of what Jung would call our complexes, those emotionally charged clusters of associations that operate autonomously within the psyche, often controlling our lives from behind the scenes. As we explore these emotional saboteurs together, I invite you to approach this journey not as a passive recipient of information, but as an active participant in a process of psychological excavation. The patterns we'll discuss will likely resonate with your own experience in ways both uncomfortable and illuminating. You might recognize yourself in the examples, feel defensive at certain observations, or experience sudden moments of clarity as pieces of your personal puzzle fall into place. This is not merely theoretical knowledge. It is living wisdom that demands engagement, reflection, and ultimately, the courage to face aspects of yourself that have remained in the shadows. Are you prepared to confront the unconscious patterns that have been silently determining the course of your life? Are you ready to step beyond the 90% and claim the emotional intelligence that is your birthright? If so, then let us begin this journey of discovery and transformation together. The human psyche, as Carl Jung revealed through decades of clinical work and personal exploration, is not merely a product of individual experience, but a manifestation of collective patterns that have existed throughout human history. These patterns, or archetypes, as Jung called them, operate as psychological templates that structure our emotional responses, often without our conscious awareness or consent. When we fail to recognize the archetypal dimensions of our emotional life, we fall prey to the first and perhaps most fundamental mistake that sabotages our potential: We take our emotions literally rather than symbolically. We mistake the surface content of our feelings for their deeper meaning, treating them as simple reactions to external circumstances rather than messages from the depths of our being. This misinterpretation leaves us powerless in the face of emotional upheaval, reacting to symptoms while remaining blind to causes. Consider how often you've been overwhelmed by an emotional response seemingly disproportionate to its trigger. A surge of rage when someone offers constructive criticism, paralyzing anxiety before an opportunity for growth, or debilitating shame over a minor social misstep. Jung would suggest that these moments reveal not merely personal sensitivities, but the activation of archetypal patterns. The criticism triggers not just disappointment but the archetypal experience of judgment and rejection. The opportunity awakens not just nervousness but the archetypal encounter with the unknown. The social mistake evokes not just embarrassment but the archetypal fear of expulsion from the tribe. When we interpret these responses literally, "I'm angry because she criticized me," or "I'm anxious because this situation is dangerous," we remain trapped in the immediate reaction, unable to access the deeper wisdom contained within the emotional experience. The collective unconscious that Jung discovered represents a psychological inheritance as real and influential as our biological inheritance. Just as our bodies carry the evolutionary history of our species, our psyches carry the emotional and symbolic patterns that have emerged throughout human history. These patterns manifest in our dreams, fantasies, and most significantly for our discussion, in our emotional reactions. The person who explodes with jealousy is experiencing not just a personal insecurity, but participating in an archetypal drama of possession and loss that has played out countless times across human cultures. The individual paralyzed by perfectionism is channeling not just personal standards, but an archetypal relationship to the ideal that has shaped human striving since the dawn of consciousness. When we fail to recognize this deeper dimension, we treat our emotions as purely personal problems to be solved, rather than as expressions of universal human experiences to be understood and integrated. This misinterpretation creates a particularly insidious form of self-sabotage, because it keeps us operating on the wrong level of engagement. We attempt to manage, suppress, or rationalize our emotions without ever understanding their deeper significance. We become like actors who have forgotten we're in a play, taking each scene literally and reacting with genuine terror, rage, or despair to what is, at a deeper level, a symbolic representation of eternal human themes. Jung observed that this literal approach to emotional life, treating each feeling as merely a reaction to current circumstances, leaves us perpetually at the mercy of unconscious forces. We exhaust ourselves fighting shadows on the wall, while remaining ignorant of the complex psychological dynamics casting those shadows. This mistake doesn't just make us emotionally reactive, it cuts us off from the profound wisdom and energy contained within our emotional experiences. The path beyond this first mistake begins with a fundamental shift in perspective, learning to ask not just, "What am I feeling?" but "What is this feeling revealing about the deeper patterns operating in my psyche?" When intense emotion arises, rather than immediately identifying with it or attempting to suppress it, we might instead approach it with curiosity. What archetypal story is trying to express itself through this emotional response? This shift doesn't diminish the reality of our feelings, but places them in a context that allows for greater understanding and agency. Jung would suggest that this approach, treating emotions as symbolic communications rather than literal realities, transforms our relationship to our inner life. Instead of being victims of emotional reactions, we become interpreters of a rich symbolic language through which the deeper layers of the psyche communicate with consciousness. This interpretive stance creates space between the immediacy of feeling and our response to it, allowing us to engage with our emotional life in a more conscious and creative manner. The second emotional mistake that sabotages 90% of people stems directly from Jung's concept of the shadow, those aspects of ourselves that we have rejected, repressed, or disowned. In the process of becoming socialized individuals, we all develop a persona, a social mask that represents who we believe we should be. This persona is constructed largely through the internalization of external expectations, cultural ideals, and early conditioning. Whatever doesn't fit this idealized self-image gets relegated to the shadow, creating a psychological division that, while necessary for initial development, becomes increasingly problematic as we mature. The mistake occurs not in having a shadow, which is inevitable, but in our persistent refusal to acknowledge and integrate the rejected aspects of our emotional reality. This rejection creates a state of partial living, where significant portions of our emotional energy remain trapped in unconscious patterns of denial, projection, and self-sabotage. The shadow contains not only our socially unacceptable impulses, our anger, selfishness, or sexuality, but also our disowned positive qualities, creativity, power, or vulnerability that somehow didn't fit our family or cultural narrative. When we reject these aspects of ourselves, they don't simply disappear. They operate autonomously in the unconscious, emerging in displaced and often destructive ways. The man who cannot acknowledge his own vulnerability becomes hypercritical of weakness in others. The woman who has repressed her ambition finds herself mysteriously sabotaging opportunities for advancement. The individual who cannot face their own capacity for aggression becomes passive-aggressive or attracts relationships characterized by unexpressed anger. Jung observed that whatever we refuse to consciously acknowledge doesn't simply vanish. It becomes a fate that meets us from the outside, often through projection onto others or through the creation of external circumstances that force an encounter with the disowned material. This shadow rejection creates a particular form of emotional dissociation that characterizes modern life. We become strangers to entire territories of our emotional landscape, operating from a fragmented sense of self that lacks authenticity and wholeness. This dissociation manifests in numerous ways. The executive who appears confident and composed at work while privately drowning in anxiety and imposter syndrome. The caregiver who attends to everyone's needs while remaining completely disconnected from their own emotional requirements. The perpetually positive individual whose hidden depression emerges through mysterious physical symptoms or self-destructive behaviors. In each case, the rejected emotional reality doesn't disappear but goes underground, gathering energy and eventually erupting in ways that seem to come from outside ourselves. A betrayal by a trusted friend, a physical illness that forces rest, or a series of accidents that bring the disowned emotions into consciousness. The emotional toll of this shadow rejection cannot be overstated. It creates a chronic state of inner division, where significant psychological energy becomes locked in the effort of keeping unwanted aspects of ourselves at bay. This defensive posture, what Jung would call the maintenance of psychological repression, requires constant vigilance and consumes vast amounts of psychic energy that might otherwise be available for creative endeavors, authentic relationships, or genuine self-development. Furthermore, this rejection creates a state of emotional falseness that others sense intuitively, if not consciously. We think we're presenting a polished, acceptable version of ourselves, but others often perceive the underlying inauthenticity, the forced smile, the artificial enthusiasm, the subtle incongruence between words and emotional presence. This disconnection from our complete emotional reality sabotages our capacity for genuine connection, as authentic relationship requires a willingness to be seen in our wholeness, shadows included. The path beyond this second mistake requires what Jung called shadow work, the courageous and compassionate exploration of our disowned emotional realities. This isn't about indulging every impulse or dramatizing our darker aspects, but about creating space for conscious relationship with the full spectrum of our humanity. It begins with simple acknowledgement. Yes, this anger, this jealousy, this desire is part of me. This acknowledgement doesn't mean these emotions must control our behavior, but it does mean they deserve recognition as legitimate aspects of our inner experience. From this recognition can emerge a more integrated relationship with our emotional life, one where we neither identify completely with our emotions nor reject them outright, but hold them in conscious awareness, extracting their wisdom while choosing our responses. Jung believed that this integration doesn't diminish our ethical capacity but enhances it, as real morality comes not from repression of our darker impulses, but from conscious relationship with them. The third emotional mistake that sabotages 90% of people involves a profound confusion between what Jung would call our personal emotional material and what belongs to our psychological inheritance. Throughout his work, Jung emphasized that we are not merely individuals with unique emotional patterns, but carriers of familial, cultural, and collective psychological legacies that shape our inner experience in ways we rarely recognize. The mistake occurs when we automatically claim every emotion that arises within us as my feeling, rather than recognizing that many of our most persistent emotional patterns actually represent unprocessed psychological material passed down through generations. This confusion of inheritance and identity locks us into emotional reactions that don't truly belong to our authentic self, creating patterns of response that feel compulsively familiar yet strangely disconnected from our deeper being. Consider the individual who grew up with a parent who experienced chronic anxiety. From earliest childhood, this person absorbed not just the visible behaviors associated with anxiety, but the underlying emotional atmosphere, the subtle bodily tensions, the implicit beliefs about the world's dangers, the unspoken rules about what constitutes safety. As an adult, they experience anxiety as an intimate, personal reality. This is just how I am, without recognizing that they're carrying an emotional pattern they inherited rather than developed naturally from their own experience. Or think about cultural inheritances, how individuals from groups that have experienced historical trauma often carry emotional responses to authority, scarcity, or threat that make perfect sense in the context of their collective history, but may be maladaptive in their present circumstances. Jung would emphasize that these inheritances aren't merely psychological, but exist at the level of what he called the collective unconscious, the deepest layer of the psyche where universal human patterns reside. This confusion between inherited emotional patterns and personal identity creates a particular form of psychological entrapment. We find ourselves enacting emotional responses that feel deeply familiar and yet somehow foreign, as if we're playing roles in a script we didn't write. The woman who cannot express anger directly because generations of women in her family were punished for showing aggression. The man who cannot allow himself emotional vulnerability because he comes from a lineage where masculine stoicism was the unquestioned norm. The child of immigrants who experiences constant performance anxiety because they've internalized their parents' message that achievement is the only path to safety in an uncertain world. In each case, the emotional pattern feels like just the way I am, rather than what it often is, an inherited psychological strategy that served others in different circumstances but may be limiting my authentic expression in the present. What makes this mistake so sabotaging is that it keeps us psychologically entangled with the past, preventing us from developing emotional responses appropriate to our actual circumstances. Jung observed that psychological freedom requires not just self-knowledge, but an understanding of how our emotional lives are shaped by forces larger than our individual experience. Without this understanding, we remain unconsciously loyal to familial and cultural emotional patterns, even when they no longer serve us or reflect our deepest values. The person who grew up in a family where love was expressed through criticism continues to interpret care through a lens of judgment. The individual whose culture equated emotional expression with weakness continues to restrict their emotional range, even in contexts where vulnerability would create connection. The descendant of those who survived through hypervigilance continues to scan for danger, even in objectively safe situations. These emotional inheritances don't just influence isolated reactions. They shape our entire orientation to life, often limiting our capacity for joy, intimacy, and authentic self-expression. The path beyond this third mistake involves what Jung might call psychological differentiation, the careful, conscious work of distinguishing between the emotional patterns we've inherited and the authentic feelings that emerge from our unique experience of being. This isn't about rejecting our inheritance, which would simply be another form of shadow creation, but about developing a conscious relationship with it, recognizing its influence without being determined by it. This process requires a particular kind of emotional archaeology, where we learn to ask, does this reaction truly belong to my experience, or am I carrying someone else's emotional reality? When we discover inherited patterns, we can honor their origin and purpose, while simultaneously creating space for new emotional responses more aligned with our present circumstances and authentic needs. Jung believed that this differentiation represents a crucial aspect of individuation, the process of becoming psychologically distinct individuals capable of conscious relationship with both our personal and collective inheritance. Having explored the theoretical foundations of the three emotional mistakes that sabotage 90% of people, let us now examine their practical manifestations in everyday life. The impact of these mistakes extends far beyond occasional emotional discomfort. They fundamentally shape our capacity for fulfilling relationships, meaningful work, and authentic self-expression. In relationships, these mistakes create patterns of connection characterized more by unconscious projection than genuine intimacy. When we take our emotions literally rather than symbolically, we constantly misinterpret our partner's actions through the distorted lens of our activated archetypes. A simple request becomes a criticism, a need for space becomes abandonment, an expression of concern becomes control. Our relationships become stages for the enactment of archetypal dramas, the eternal struggle between freedom and commitment, individuality and merger, power and vulnerability, without our conscious awareness or consent. In our professional lives, these emotional mistakes manifest as persistent patterns of self-limitation and sabotage. The individual who has rejected ambitious aspects of their shadow mysteriously undermines opportunities for advancement. The person carrying ancestral patterns of scarcity maintains a scarcity mindset even amid objective abundance. The team leader projecting unacknowledged insecurity creates an atmosphere of micromanagement and distrust. Jung observed that unconscious emotional patterns don't remain confined to our inner experience. They shape our external reality through the choices they compel, the opportunities they blind us to, and the relationships they attract. The executive who cannot acknowledge vulnerability creates a corporate culture where others feel unsafe showing weakness. The creative professional who has inherited beliefs about the impossibility of combining artistic integrity with financial success continually makes choices that reinforce this assumed incompatibility. The individual carrying unrecognized generational trauma around authority finds themselves repeatedly in conflict with supervisors, regardless of the actual dynamics present. Perhaps most significantly, these emotional mistakes progressively alienate us from our authentic sense of purpose and meaning. Jung emphasized throughout his work that emotional wholeness is not merely about feeling better. It is about becoming who we truly are, fulfilling the unique psychological potential encoded in our individual nature. When we operate from unconscious emotional patterns, we make life choices based not on our authentic values and capacities, but on the unexamined assumptions, fears, and loyalties that govern our emotional responses. The person who chooses a profession based on family expectations rather than personal calling. The individual who avoids intimate commitment due to unacknowledged fears inherited from parental divorce. The creative spirit who abandons artistic pursuits because they've internalized cultural messages about the impracticality of creative work. In each case, the emotional mistake doesn't just create psychological discomfort. It actively redirects life energy away from authentic expression and toward the maintenance of unconscious patterns. This redirection of life energy represents perhaps the greatest cost of these emotional mistakes, what Jung might call the tragedy of the unlived life. When significant portions of our psychological energy are consumed by the management of unconscious emotional patterns, that energy becomes unavailable for genuine creation, connection, and contribution. We find ourselves living lives characterized more by avoidance of discomfort than pursuit of meaning, more by adherence to inherited patterns than exploration of authentic possibilities. This dynamic explains why many people reach midlife feeling simultaneously exhausted and unfulfilled. They have expended enormous energy maintaining psychological defenses and fulfilling unconscious loyalties while neglecting the development of their authentic potential. The executive who achieves external success while feeling emotionally hollow. The parent who fulfills all the expected responsibilities while losing connection with their authentic desires. The individual who maintains a socially acceptable persona while experiencing a growing sense of alienation from their deeper self. In each case, The emotional mistakes have directed life energy toward the maintenance of unconscious patterns rather than the expression of authentic being. The practical consequences of these mistakes highlight why emotional intelligence, as Jung conceptualized it, involves much more than managing our feelings or maintaining pleasant states. True emotional intelligence requires developing a conscious relationship with the full depth and complexity of our emotional reality, recognizing its archetypal dimensions, integrating its shadowed aspects, and differentiating our authentic responses from our psychological inheritance. Without this deeper engagement, we remain reactive rather than creative, defined by unconscious patterns rather than conscious choices. The good news, as Jung consistently emphasized, is that these patterns are not immutable fate. With awareness, courage, and appropriate guidance, we can transform our relationship to our emotional life, redirecting psychological energy from the maintenance of unconscious patterns toward the expression of our authentic potential. This transformation doesn't happen through technique alone, but through a fundamental shift in how we understand and engage with our emotional experience. Having explored the 3 emotional mistakes that sabotage 90% of people and their practical implications, we now turn to the path of liberation that Jung's psychology illuminates. This path begins not with techniques for emotional management, but with a radical shift in our relationship to our inner experience. Rather than treating emotions as problems to be solved or inconveniences to be overcome, we learn to approach them as messengers carrying information from the deeper layers of the psyche. This shift from control to curiosity represents the first step toward emotional liberation. When intense emotion arises, whether anxiety before an important presentation, anger in response to a perceived slight, or grief that seems disproportionate to its trigger, we learn to ask, what is this emotion trying to communicate? What deeper pattern or need is expressing itself through this feeling? This questioning stance creates space between the immediacy of emotional reaction and our response to it, allowing us to engage with our emotions as sources of information rather than dictators of behavior. The second aspect of this liberation involves what Jung called making the unconscious conscious, the methodical work of illuminating the shadow material that shapes our emotional responses without our awareness. This process requires both courage and compassion, as we turn toward aspects of ourselves that we have long avoided or denied. The executive acknowledging their fear of inadequacy beneath a persona of confident authority. The perpetual caregiver recognizing their resentment alongside their genuine desire to nurture. The rational professional accepting their intuitive knowing alongside their analytical thinking. Jung emphasized that this integration doesn't happen through intellectual understanding alone, but requires active engagement with the symbolic language through which the unconscious communicates. Dreams, fantasies, creative expression, and the projection patterns revealed in our relationships. As we develop the capacity to recognize and relate to previously disowned aspects of our emotional reality, we expand our psychological repertoire, gaining access to energies and perspectives previously lost in the shadow. The third dimension of emotional liberation involves the differentiation of personal authenticity from psychological inheritance. This requires developing what Jung might call a psychological immune system, the capacity to recognize when we're reacting from inherited patterns rather than responding from our authentic center. This differentiation begins with conscious relationship to our personal and collective history. The woman raised by a chronically anxious mother learns to distinguish between inherited vigilance and her own assessment of safety. The man from a culture that equates emotional expression with weakness develops the capacity to recognize and honor his natural sensitivity. The individual carrying generational patterns of scarcity cultivates awareness of abundance, even as the inherited fear of not enough arises. This differentiation doesn't reject our inheritance, which would simply create another form of psychological splitting, but develops a conscious relationship with it, honoring its origins while creating space for new patterns more aligned with our present reality and authentic needs. The fourth element in this path of liberation involves what Jung called active imagination, the deliberate engagement with our emotional life through symbolic forms of expression. Unlike purely analytical approaches that treat emotions as problems to be understood, Active imagination engages with emotions as living energies seeking expression and transformation. This might involve dialogue with personified aspects of our emotional reality, creative expression through art, movement, or writing, or the conscious exploration of the images and narratives that emerge spontaneously during periods of emotional intensity. Through these practices, we develop the capacity to not merely understand our emotions intellectually, but to engage with them as dynamic forces within the psyche, capable of transformation through conscious relationship. The anxiety that initially appears as paralyzing fear might, through active imagination, reveal itself as excited anticipation needing direction. The anger that presents as destructive rage might disclose its underlying protective function when approached with curiosity rather than suppression. Finally, emotional liberation culminates in what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole through the integration of conscious and unconscious aspects of the personality. This doesn't mean achieving a state of perpetual happiness or freedom from emotional challenge, but rather developing the capacity to experience the full range of human emotion without being dominated by unconscious patterns. The individuated person still experiences fear, anger, grief, and desire, but relates to these emotions from a center of awareness that isn't identified with any particular emotional state. This integration creates a profound shift in our experience of life, from being victims of emotional reactions to becoming conscious participants in the unfolding of our psychological reality. We discover that emotions need not be either indulged without restraint or suppressed without acknowledgement, but can be held in a conscious field of awareness that allows their energy and information to inform rather than control our choices. This capacity for conscious emotional engagement represents not just psychological health in the conventional sense, but the fulfillment of our potential as human beings capable of both profound feeling and conscious choice. In our journey through the landscape of emotional sabotage, we've illuminated three fundamental mistakes that keep the vast majority of people trapped in unconscious patterns: taking emotions literally rather than symbolically, rejecting shadow aspects of our emotional reality, and confusing our psychological inheritance with our authentic identity. As Jung recognized throughout his work, these mistakes aren't simply personal failings, but manifestations of a collective disconnection from the deeper dimensions of human experience. In our modern world, with its emphasis on external achievement, rational understanding, and quick solutions, we've lost touch with the symbolic language of the psyche, the necessity of shadow integration, and the profound influence of our psychological inheritance. This disconnection doesn't just create personal suffering, it diminishes our collective capacity for authentic connection, creative expression, and meaningful contribution to a world desperately in need of emotionally whole individuals. What might emerge if we began to approach our emotional life with the depth and seriousness it deserves? Imagine relationships characterized not by unconscious projection and reactivity, but by the conscious meeting of whole beings, each engaged in their own process of integration and differentiation. Envision workplaces where leadership emerges not from the compulsive enactment of unexamined power dynamics, but from authentic presence and conscious relationship to both shadow and strength. Consider communities where differences in emotional expression are recognized not as problems to be homogenized, but as manifestations of the rich diversity of human experience, each offering unique perspective and contribution. Jung believed that such transformation begins not with systemic change imposed from outside, but with the courageous work of individuals willing to face their own unconscious patterns and develop conscious relationship with the full depth of their emotional reality. This work of emotional liberation isn't a luxury reserved for those with abundant time and resources. It is an evolutionary necessity in a world facing unprecedented challenges. The complex problems confronting humanity today cannot be solved from the same level of consciousness that created them. They require individuals capable of moving beyond reactive patterns, integrating shadow aspects of human nature, and differentiating authentic response from unconscious inheritance. As Jung observed, genuine psychological development isn't merely a private matter, but a contribution to collective evolution. Each person who engages seriously with their emotional mistakes and works toward greater wholeness creates ripples that extend far beyond their individual life. The parent who integrates their shadow rather than projecting it onto their children. The leader who differentiates authentic authority from inherited power dynamics. The creative individual who channels emotional energy into meaningful expression rather than unconscious enactment. Each represents not just personal healing, but a contribution to the psychological development of humanity as a whole. The path beyond emotional sabotage doesn't promise perpetual happiness or freedom from life's inherent challenges. What it offers instead is something far more valuable: the capacity to meet those challenges from a place of wholeness rather than fragmentation, conscious choice rather than compulsive reaction. As Jung emphasized throughout his work, the goal of psychological development isn't the absence of suffering, but the capacity to find meaning within it. When we approach our emotional life with depth and seriousness, recognizing its archetypal dimensions, integrating its shadowed aspects, and differentiating our authentic responses from our psychological inheritance, we discover resources of resilience, creativity, and wisdom that remain inaccessible to those caught in unconscious patterns. We become capable not just of enduring life's inevitable difficulties, but of transforming them into opportunities for deeper understanding and more authentic expression. As our exploration comes to a close, I leave you with a question that Jung might pose. What aspect of your unlived life is waiting for recognition in the emotions you've been avoiding or denying? Within what you've labeled as inappropriate anxiety, irrational anger, or excessive sensitivity might lie the seeds of your authentic expression, awaiting integration and conscious direction. The emotional mistakes we've explored aren't failures to be judged, but invitations to deeper engagement with the mystery of your own being. The emotions that have seemed most problematic may, when approached with curiosity rather than judgment, reveal themselves as messengers carrying vital information about your authentic needs and untapped potential. This journey of emotional liberation isn't completed in a single insight or practice, but unfolds throughout a lifetime of conscious engagement with the ever-deepening mystery of human experience. If you found value in this exploration and wish to continue the journey, I invite you to like this video, share it with others who might benefit, and subscribe to our channel for more content exploring the depths of human psychology through the wisdom of Carl Jung and other pioneers of psychological understanding. Together, we can move beyond the emotional mistakes that have limited human potential and toward the more conscious, integrated way of being that our world so urgently needs.